has put eternity in the hearts of man, yet they cannot fathom what he has done from beginning to end. There's a sense in all human beings there's more to life than meets the eye. And there's something beyond death, but we can't quite figure it out. He's put eternity in the hearts of men who believe. Man cannot fathom what he has done from beginning to end. Fourth similarity is sociocultural. And this has to do with similarities in the basics of the sociocultural systems that we operate within. So we have biological needs for food, shelter, that kind of thing. So societies create sociocultural structures to provide for those needs. So society creates structures to provide housing for people. We all have a need for shelter. Right? That becomes a sociological structure that is created. Whether it's, our culture where, the culture is trying to provide housing for families in America. So the government develops Fannie Mae and these other institutions. The goal is to get people into houses eventually, to provide loans. So we build all these structures to do that. Well, in traditional cultures, maybe in a village somewhere in the middle of Africa, there would be a structure for when children grow up, how are they going to have a place to live? And society orients that. In some cultures, it's, there's every family has a house and the second story is not quite built yet. That will be built when, the kids get married and now they'll get the second story and they'll build the second story together. Those are culturally conditioned processes to provide for those needs in that culture. All right, so how do we evaluate, I talked about evaluating cultural forms. We do evaluate our cultural forms. And that's just we all do that. We have an innate evaluator where we're always evaluating things. Do we like this? Do we not like it? And it's the criteria that we're using that really greatly influences how we evaluate whether this is a good form or not a good form. For example, and Kraft uses these examples. He talks about, for a weapon, is a gun better or a rock better? Well, it depends on the criteria that you're using. If it's about efficiency, the gun is better. Pull the trigger, it's done. Okay? But if you are talking about your criteria is accessibility, and you are up on a hill somewhere and there's rocks flying all over, it's a rocky hill, and you have to run back to the house to get the gun, well, the rock is a better weapon. It's all based on your criteria. Let's see. He also gives an example of light. So, what's the best form of light? Well, it depends. If your criteria is, lighting this room, so brightness in this room, then these kind of lights work pretty good. We evaluate that as successful. But if you're on a camping trip, your criteria is not how bright the room will be. Your criteria is portability. And so you're not going to bring the big fluorescents. You're going to have a flashlight. We evaluate that as the best thing. So criteria is very important. So in American culture, we have this criteria, this strong value of freedom. And so we use that, we will use that criteria to evaluate behavior that will allow people to do things in the name of freedom that actually harm the group as a whole? That's a big debate right now, right?
Yeah.
You know, should the government be allowed to have all your data and be able to filter all your computer data, your emails, everything else? Well, everybody's up in arms about it because of our criteria of freedom. Freedom is so important. We don't want our freedoms encroached upon. Yet, it's probably making us less safe as a nation, as a whole. It's bringing harm or potential harm to the group. But because our criteria is freedom, our evaluation of that government NSA practice is, we don't like it. But if you're in China, your evaluation may be different. You may look at that radically different and think, of course, the government should be able to do that. Or if you were in, you know, former Soviet Union and you have this historical recollection of the KGB doing this all the time and throwing people in jail for it, you may process it in a different way as well. All right, so our criteria affects our evaluation. So when we're evaluating culture, here's some cultural forms, not culture, but cultural forms. That would be, the difference is, sometimes when I use the word culture, then I'm speaking of the whole culture and all the patterns. We got to be careful not to do that, but to isolate the individual practices and evaluate them. All right, we'll talk about why we should do that later. But by being careful and thoughtful, then we can discover some of our own unconsciously employed criteria. If we go into this with eyes open and intentional, then one of the values is that we can recognize, oh, that's why I feel this is good or this is bad, because these are the criteria that I'm using. Okay, so it's good to identify that. Number two, for learning to employ more appropriate criteria. When we go into a different culture, recognizing that if I take my criteria and try to apply it in this culture, that may not be appropriate. It might not fit in that culture. And recognizing that that's a cultural system that has a set of criteria that it's built on that makes it work. So learning that those criteria are appropriate in that particular culture setting. Number three, it helps us to learn to evaluate components of culture rather than whole cultures. So, that's a very healthy process, of breaking it down and not making these blanket statements about a culture, but rather isolating individual practices, behaviors, thoughts, dealing with those cultural forms. Number four, recognizing the complexity of the task. And the more I dig, the more I think about this, the more complex it seems. Number five, recognizing the probability that we will be culturally biased. And that's important. Just to know right up front, I'm going to be biased. I'm going to have a particular slant, but it is shaped by my culture. Might not be shaped by what is supracultural, what is outside of culture in God's eyes. We'll talk about supracultural stuff later. Number six, developing a cautious and humble attitude in our evaluating. And that's a really good thing, to be humble in our approach to other cultures and behaviors. All right, So, 5 principles for evaluating culture. Did you need that still? Any questions on this stuff? Is this making sense?
Yeah. Is it on D2L or is it going to be on D2L?
If I can get my shell set up, so hopefully, yes.
Okay.
Hopefully next week I can get this up. Yeah. And you're going to read it again. I'm drawing this from Craft. Okay. Kind of boiling it down here. And so, have you read this stuff already, this chapter?
It's coming up.
Yeah, it's coming up. So we're talking about it ahead of time. You're going to read through in detail. So 2 passes at it's going to help. In November, Brittany's going to do a review for us over the first 10 chapters of Craft. And that's going to help as well to kind of process all this. Okay, 5 principles for evaluating culture. And particularly we're talking about when we're going cross-culturally, we're coming into another culture and we're thinking about these cultural forms that we see when we're making evaluations, because we always make evaluations, right? So we might as well make better evaluations rather than not good ones. First, look at every cultural system in terms of its own ideals, not those of another culture. So again, that's that sociocultural adequacy thing happening. We're recognizing that those things make sense within that culture. And so think within that culture instead of trying to compare it to another similar culture or another culture. What issues does this system raise, and how well do the functions address the issues? So, no system is perfect. Our housing system isn't perfect in America, right? We've created this housing system, but it's not perfect. And there are issues that rise. Well, how well do our practices solve those issues? Number 2, be constantly aware of the pervasiveness of sin, including in our own culture. We must never forget, it's pervasive in our culture, it's pervasive in other cultures. So every sociocultural system falls short of adequately meeting the needs of the culture. So being aware of the fact that these are attempts, but they're not perfect attempts. Number 3, recognize we see less of what God is doing in a culture than we think we do. Recognize we see less of what God is doing in the culture than we think we do. Paul says it this way: I see as in a mirror dimly. What we see is not all that God is doing.
That's good.
So we need to be aware of that. God is at work in cultures before we ever get there. In fact, Paul writes in Acts that he has not left any nation without a witness. They've gone their own way, but he's not left them without witness. He's still at work in cultures, even when they reject. In fact, Eternity in Their Hearts, a book by Don Richardson, he talks about cultural compasses. His theory is that within cultures, based on that verse in Acts, within every culture, God has left things within the culture, metaphors, cultural practices or forms that when the gospel comes, those things can point toward Jesus. So, for example, when the missionaries when Hudson Taylor recruited 1,000 missionaries to go to China in between 1850 and 1900, and they pressed into the interior of China, and they took on some of the cultural forms. They really, unlike previous missionaries that just lived on the coast and lived like Westerners, they dressed like the Chinese. They went in, they really learned the language, and as they were learning the language, they discovered that there were some words in the ancient Chinese language, in their written form, had striking similarities with concepts in the book of Genesis. You know, Chinese is a pictorial language, ideographs, and they use radicals that they combine together to create something like 30,000 different picture words, ideographs. And as they're in there studying and learning these words, these ideographs, they saw some things like the word for boat was a combination of two things. It was the ideograph for vessel and for 8 people. 8 people in a vessel is the word boat. Well, how many people were on the ark? 8. Well, that's a weird kind of correlation. The Chinese, ancient Chinese word for desire was a picture of 2 trees with a woman in between facing one of the trees. Wow. Sounds a bit like Genesis chapter 2 or 3.
Wow.
And they discovered like 150 of these ideographs that had correlation to something in Genesis, early part of Genesis. And you know, there's a story that Don Richardson talks about where, you know, one missionary is pointing this out to a Chinese man who is in the army, and at one point he says, "Wait, you're trying to tell me that my own language is telling me about God." And so that would be a cultural compass, something in the culture that can be used as a witness toward God. All right, God is at work in culture before you ever get there. Number 4, religious systems provide not just vertical functions, but also horizontal functions. Many of the religious functions that are in forms can be retained when Christianity comes in, the religion of the people. Some of the forms, the cultural patterns of doing that religion, many of them can be retained within Christianity. Because they provide value not just in the connection horizontally to God, but they also provide value in the relationships among people. For example, when you go to Nepal and you go into church, they don't have chairs. Everybody sits on the floor. And Nepal is a place of Hinduism and Buddhism, and so, you know, it's Westerners that would bring chairs into worship or a pew into church. They sit on the floor. They sit cross-legged, like so. And I don't know how they do it. I mean, they sit there for hours, and I'm like squirming all the time. My legs are killing me after an hour. I'm moving all around. They're good at it. Culturally conditioned. But they sit where all the females are on one side and the males are on another side.
It's like that in Islam too, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So if you're going to build churches in those contexts, you know, we come in and we think, no, men and women, they should be together. They should be equality, you know, egalitarian, blah, blah, blah. But we're filtering it by our criteria of how men and women should relate to one another. That's our cultural forms of how men and women should relate to one another. Those cultures have their own forms that dictate how men and women relate to one another. And so it's not evil for men and women to sit on 2 separate sides of the church.
I heard it's like, in Islam at least, when I was taking that class, Major World Religions, we were reading about it, and it said it was more like to protect the women because they bowed down. And
Right.
so it's like, you know, if they had them mixed together, it'd be like,
You don't want to see
awkward.
up their skirt. I mean,
yeah,
that's what, yeah.
yeah, and so it's more like the things that they do where they separate women, it's more like to protect them,
Yeah.
and to like keep their dignity.
Yeah, out of respect.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we come in, we don't see that at first, and so we can really offend by
Yeah.
imposing some of our cultural practices.
Yeah.
Okay? Number 5, all people need Christ, but without converting from all their cultural forms. There's a universal need that all human beings have for relationship with God through Christ. But that doesn't mean people need all the cultural forms that we include in the way we worship in church. You know, we sing, but there's cultures that they dance when they come together. Well, we do our little Western dance, but it's not the same, let me tell you.
That blesses me that they
Yeah,
worship like that.
yeah. And so dancing, poetry is really significant in some Middle Eastern cultures. And so why not have poetry as part of the worship experience? That's what really connects with the heart.
Yeah.
It may be more important than singing any songs in some cultures. All right. Universals and cultural forms. We have to distinguish between absolutes and universals and constants from the relative cultural forms. So that's kind of an overview of what I said at the beginning, that there are universals. We have, you know, the same biological, spiritual, psychological needs. Those are universals. But how we meet those needs are cultural forms. Those are different. So separating those two. One example is that sinfulness is universal. Human beings are sinful all over the world. But the way we perceive a sinful action is different. What is sinful behavior varies from culture to culture.
Can you give us an example?
Yes. We would say it's sinful to lie to someone. Another culture would perceive it as sinful if you in your attempt to be honest and give your true feedback about how you felt about what that person said, that you didn't like what they said, because you're going to be honest, you don't want to tell a lie, so you're going to speak honestly. Well, in other cultures that are all about saving face, it's better for you to not tell how you really feel and to tell them what we would consider a lie, because you would be insulting them and shaming them in public. That's sinful, for you to do things that would bring shame on them. So better not to speak the truth as we define it. All right. There's other ways. See, they've got a lot of other cultural clues to express how they think without maybe non-verbally, without bringing shame. So That would be
Okay.
one way. It's always bugged Westerners when we go to other countries and we see people, you know, just telling other people what they want to hear, even though it's a bold-faced lie. And that just really annoys Westerners to no end. But there's more involved than what we think. We're willing to insult someone or tell them what they're doing isn't working, whatever. Well, that's a great insult to that person in that culture. So,
Which would draw them away
uh,
if you're trying to make an impact.
yeah. You know, we have a sense of for you to yell at a stranger on the street for what they're doing that was minor, that's inappropriate. We would put that maybe in, you know, you've got an issue you need to deal with, this is a character flaw in you. All right? But in West Africa, it's sinful if you don't say something to that stranger. You just let them do their thing and you didn't speak up. Then you're the one who's
What was that guy doing that one time when he told us that story about he yelled out the window?
Oh, I don't know, because it happens all the time.
Oh, okay.
Usually they're like walking on the side of the road, you know, and cars are coming along, or, you know, they just step out too close to the car, or it's usually just the minorest little things that you think, you know.
Yeah.
But for him, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So hard to give one example because I see it again and again, and they're all minor.
Did you see more than one person doing it, though? It wasn't like just his personality?
Yeah, it's an African cultural thing, but he does it even more because those in leadership do.
Oh.
It's expected.
Mm.
The importance of interpreting the meaning of the cultural form. So, thinking about what does this cultural form mean, getting to the heart of that really helps you understand it. Communicate universals through cultural forms that are appropriate to the cultural system. So, you know, the gospel is universal. We're all in need of a Savior. But how we communicate that, we need to use terms that work. So, you know, 2 decades ago, and our culture's changing, right? So the way we even communicate the gospel in our own culture is changing to be effective. 4 spiritual laws used to work because that fit our cultural pattern. We connected with that. 4 spiritual laws is not so significant anymore for people. It doesn't connect with their heart. We are much more focused on, you know, not that we're separated in need of a Savior, but Jesus has come to give you life and life to its fullest. That connects with people.
Mm-hmm.
We want fullness of life. And that's found in Christ. More than we want forgiveness of sin.
Yeah.
We need both.